And I think the important part of this, to step back for a moment, is the nature of the system. And so the way I would think about this is to contrast a market transaction, a private market transaction, with any transaction involving the government. And they are fundamentally different on a variety of margins. When we engage in market interactions, when I purchase a cup of coffee from the local coffee shop, I'm the consumer and I'm directly interacting with the producer that is selling me the final consumer good. So there is a direct linkage between me using my phone to pay for it and getting the good that I am consuming. Anytime you introduce government into anything, education being one example of this, but one of many, it introduces other parties. And what happens is they take money from you in the form of taxes. They make decisions how to spend it. So they hire the producers, they purchase the goods, if you will, and then they give them to you, whether you want them or not.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Fillman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Thank you for tuning into The Reason We Learn. If you're not already a subscriber, make sure you click the subscribe button and bell so you'll be notified of future episodes. Earlier, I had the great pleasure of sitting down to talk with Christopher and Rachel Coyne. Chris is a professor of economics at George Mason University and the associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. And his wife, Rachel, is a senior fellow in the same program. Chris is also director of the Initiative for the Study of Stable Peace and the co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and of the Independent Review. Rachel's research is focused in the areas of political economy, public choice, and economic development, and her work has been published in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Public Choice, the Journal of Public Finance and Public Choice, and the Independent Review. With Chris, she co-edited both the Handbook on the Political Economy of War and Flaws and Ceilings, Price Controls, and the Damage They Cause. I first learned about Chris on a recent episode of the Kate Wan podcast. Chris was talking to Kate about the book he co-authored entitled How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. It's a satire. It's just out this year, and listening to him, it struck me that the information and ideas he was sharing about the military-industrial complex could almost be applied equally to the education-industrial complex. When I asked him to sit for an interview to discuss the similarities and what parents need to know about them, he suggested Rachel join him because they homeschool their children, and they each had their own perspectives to share on the topic. In this episode, you'll learn how the philosophy and economic incentives inherent in our education system affect the quality of education our kids receive, and the degree to which parents can and can't improve it. We will also talk about the education philosophy that led them to homeschool and what advice they'd give the parents in the audience. Hi, Chris and Rachel. How are you today?
Hi, Deb. We're doing great. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to talk to you. You have such a breadth of knowledge and an interesting background. I think is going to help my listeners, my audience, quite a bit. I'd like to dive right in and talk about something you, Chris, spoke about when you were recently on the Kate Wan podcast. You were talking about collectivism versus individualism. This is something I touch on my channel quite a bit. I'm an individualist. I try to drive that point home quite a lot. And I think one of the big problems we have in education right now is philosophical, that we are being trained to be collectivists. And I'm wondering if you could we'll just start there.
Yeah, I certainly think you're right, by the way. The distinction between individualism and collectivism is a high-level distinction, but it's an important one because it frames a whole host of issues, practical policy issues, and so on. And education's certainly one of them. And so I think it makes sense to step back for a moment and think about what these terms mean. The idea of individualism, in the broadest sense, is that rights are imbued in the individual. The individual is the ultimate sovereign, that they have agency over their person, over their choices, that human dignity is held up as a primary value. And from this standpoint, really our focus is on the person, the actual individual person. So in some sense, a way to think about individualism is true diversity, not in the aggregated way it's talked about today in terms of aggregated identity markers, race, gender, ethnicity, whatever margin people want to talk about, but the fact that individualism recognizes that each individual is unique and creative and different unto themselves. The contrast to that is collectivism. Collectivism focuses on the group. It recognizes that individuals exist, but those individuals are subservient or in the background to the larger group or community. And so when people talk about collectivism, it sounds nice because what they'll oftentimes say is things like, well, individualists are focused on self-interested people and selfishness, and collectivists are focused on altruism and other regarding behavior. But very quickly, this distinction breaks down, both empirically, when you actually look at people. That is, we look around the world and we see people who oftentimes help other people, not because they're forced to by members of the collective, but because they're human beings who have sympathy and empathy for their fellow human beings. But the other issue that we can talk about later on when it comes to education is someone has to run a collectivist system. So the group, the collective, doesn't act because there is no group or collective. There's a collection of people, but someone has to make a decision. And typically what happens is a small segment of the collective accumulates an enormous amount of power, of discretionary decision-making. And ultimately what they end up doing is imposing their valuations upon other people in the name of the collective, in the name of the public good. And so very quickly, when you look historically, whether it's in economics, so economic systems like under central planning, if you look at the military sector, if you look at the education sector, what happens is you get a very small group of elites, some mix of private and public actors, who end up imposing their values, what they think is good, on the collective. And as we can talk about in a little bit, there's various incentives and forces at work which lead to a divergence, a wedge between the actions that are often taken by those elites and the actual interests of the people that they purport to support and advance.
Wow. Speaking of those incentives, I think one of the challenges my audience members face is they don't necessarily know what those are. The system at this point is so huge and arcane. They still believe they're the customer. They're the end user. You'll hear people at school board meetings saying, you need to answer to us. You work for us or similar. And when I watch these things, I feel bad because I know that's not true. And I'm wondering if you can explain from an economics point of view why that's not true, because I'm not very good at that.
Sure. So the incentive is always going to lie in the actors. So if you have, for example, we have something called regulatory capture. So you have regulators that are supposed to regulate an industry, and you think, oh, they're going to protect us, right? They're going to do what's right for the customer. But they often end up working in the interests of the industry they're supposed to be regulating. So we see the same sort of thing happen in education. So you can look at, what are the teachers' interests? What are the bureaucrats' interests? They often do not align with what the parents' interests are, or what children want who are in school. There's often the big wedge between what you think that they're interested in and what they're actually interested in. And a lot of this comes down to money. I mean, the real driver here is money for schools. So you'll often see people saying, if they just had more money, we could have better outcomes, right? So that there's always this push to hire more people, to get more administrators. We need better equipment. We need better books. We need better, whatever you can put into the system that gets them more power, more money, more people into that pipeline. And that's really at odds with, what might be best for the children you're trying to educate.
Yeah, and I think the important part of this, to step back for a moment, is the nature of the system. And so the way I would think about this is to contrast a market transaction, a private market transaction, with any transaction involving the government. And they are fundamentally different on a variety of margins. When we engage in market interactions, when I purchase a cup of coffee from the local coffee shop, I'm the consumer and I'm directly interacting with the producer that is selling me the final consumer good. So there is a direct linkage between me using my phone to pay for it and getting the good that I am consuming. Anytime you introduce government into anything, education being one example of this, but one of many, it introduces other parties. And what happens is they take money from you in the form of taxes. They make decisions how to spend it. So they hire the producers, they purchase the goods, if you will, and then they give them to you, whether you want them or not. And when you introduce those additional layers, there's a disconnect, which is systematic. It's the nature of the system. There's a disconnect between your interests as a consumer and what the interests of the producer are, because the producer is no longer trying to satisfy the private consumer. They're now trying to satisfy their political masters, who are the customers, because they have control of the purse strings of the budget. And so it's a matter of introducing additional parties into the process, which distort the incentives of producers. And so I think it's important to note that this way of reasoning about things is powerful because, number one, it recognizes the role of incentives, as you noted. But number two, it doesn't require us to assume anything about people being malicious or nefarious. Certainly people are in the world, but that's in all walks of life. It simply requires that they respond to incentives, and they don't have the incentive to provide you, the consumer, with the same level of service, the same quality of service, and to meet your preferences, because they're not directly responsible to you like they are in my coffee example. And that's the root cause of what Rachel's getting at, because once you introduce these other parties into it, then all of a sudden special interests, various influences are going to come out of the woodwork because they want a piece of the pie as well. They want to get what benefits them, and they recognize that if they don't, other people will. And so then you get this intense competition amongst bureaucrats, amongst private contractors, amongst unions, who are all trying to get their hand in the pot before other people do. And of course, ultimately what happens is that the supposed customers, the students and their parents in the case of education, it's not that they have no say in the process, but as you pointed out, they have very little say. Even though the rhetoric that's used is that they have a say, and that ultimately the various educators and elites that are running the education system claim that they're providing a good and service to those customers.
Right. So this explains how some parents listening might think, well, I had a great teacher, or my kid's school is good and they're happy there. Nothing you've said precludes it working out okay for somebody, right? It's that you've just said that the locus of control is so many steps away from you, the parent, and the incentives are not to please you. The fact that an individual teacher decided they take their job very seriously and they decide to be professional and they decide to do their best job, and that's something they're personally motivated to do, that's great. But that could also be luck. In other words, it's not necessarily the system's priority to do that.
And they might be great. They might be great educators in the scope of things they can control. They might be wonderful people. Many of them are. But it's equivalent to saying, I went to the U.S. local postal office and had a good experience because the person was nice. That is possible, and it happens all the time. Yes. But then you step back and look at the U.S. Postal Service and you say, how is this organization constantly bankrupt? Well, because of systematic incentives, because that's the nature of the beast. And those incentives are different than, for instance, FedEx or UPS faces, because of the nature of the entity itself.
Right. And also, just because something might work for you or did work for you 20, 30, 40 years ago, doesn't mean it does for everyone. And there's still that moral and ethical dilemma of how right or wrong is it to confiscate the funds and conscript the children and in a free country. And we're getting back to the collectivism versus individualism thing. I find that to be an inherent contradiction.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. And I think more and more people, even in their own lives, are starting to think about the big question: what makes for a good life? And that really gets at what I think is the core of when we think about how we're going to educate our kids, is what do we want our kids' lives to look like? And it doesn't have to look like what it looked like for us when we were growing up. It could look like something different, but we have to have the imagination and the ability to think individually to say, can I picture some other life for my kids other than what the system has offered me? And might that be better? Might that be different and better for them? Especially since we know that all of our kids are very different. I mean, if you have multiple kids, you know that their personalities are different. The way they learn is different. What they're interested in is different. If we can think about that and think, well, if we're putting every single kid that's so different into this same box through this same institutional system where we're trying to just, stamp out these widgets where they're all going to be the same, right? We can churn out these robots that are all going to be able to do the same math, write the same paper with the same format. If we can step outside of that and say, well, if they're all really different individuals, maybe education could look different for each kid because it could really specialize to what that child is good at, what they're passionate about. And that could really end up making a great life for them that looks different than what we had from the system.
That's a great point. And what's fascinating to me is that the public schools especially seem to have embraced the notion of individual differences when it comes to culture. Like, throw it all out, everything traditional, everything that comes from your own family, like get rid of it. And I mean, even get rid of your sex, get rid of it all and invent and reinvent and so on. But we're still having them all take the same math class and read the same books. And then what you find is there's a tremendous amount of conformity within the materials. So it seems to be a pretty big contradiction that, you're not actually encouraging individualism with the curriculum, the pedagogy, and that's not just within the government system. It's even in private schools. I get confused. Sometimes it actually hurts my brain to think about the contradictions. But when you talk about finding, imagining a different kind of future or a different path or what we want their life to be, can you expound on that a little bit more when you talk about what kind of life? I think a lot of parents are quickly imagining, okay, so we go to school for this many years and then college, it's got to be a good college, and then maybe grad school, maybe not grad school, and then, job, career. We were in this career path push. Even when I meet homeschoolers or parents will come to me and say, well, I want to homeschool. I want to make sure they get into a good college. And like, how, can they still get into college? And what about this? And I'm thinking, if you're going to come out of the system, free your mind, like the song says, and the rest will follow. But tell me more about how you think about that.
I think that's the hardest part, actually. When you choose to pick something outside the system, is really embracing the possibilities that come with that. And that's hard, because if all you've been taught our lives, all we were taught, I mean, I was K through 12 public school. So I went through the system. I know that it's all about getting into the good college, getting the career, the car, the house, the picket fence, the 2 kids, everything looks perfect, right? But there are so many different ways your life could turn out and that it could look. And I think if we open that up for education too, and we think, well, what could the day look like if you didn't have to sit at a desk for 6 hours or 8 hours? What could you do with your day? And if you start thinking about that and thinking, well, what are your kids passionate about? What if you had the choice as a child? What would you have loved to spend a big portion of your day doing? And what would have happened if someone let you have a big chunk of your day to do that? How might your life as a child have been different, but also how might your trajectory through life have changed? If you had someone who said, I see that you're good at this, or I see that you're passionate about this, and I'm going to embrace that, and I'm going to give you space to explore that. And I think that's really the key is saying, instead of having a blueprint for what we think our kids should be doing X, Y, Z, and that's going to lead us to some certain predetermined outcome that the parent, has decided that they should have, instead going, maybe it should be a little bit more in their hands to decide what kind of life would I want. If I could go back and change my childhood, how would that have made my life turn out differently? And I try to, with our kids, I think about that a lot too. Like, which things really matter a lot to them, and let's give them space to explore those things. In addition to maybe doing some things that I think, oh, mom thinks that this is kind of important for you to know, so I guess we'll do a little bit of that too. But you can find this path that may look a lot different than what other people have done, but that leads to really unique outcomes for each kid, but outcomes that could lead to a happier life. And for me, that's really the end game. It's not about achieving a certain path. It's about achieving ultimate life happiness and doing the thing that makes you happy to get out of bed every day.
And notice you can only start to think in that way when you embrace individualism, when you recognize that the focus, the primary focus of your way of thinking is the individual, because then you start realizing, well, what is going to empower that person to live a flourishing life, rather than that person needs to conform to the blueprint that is set by the experts in order to be like everyone else. Those are very different frames for viewing the world. And as Rachel put it, I think quite nicely, and this has certainly influenced the way we think about it, the dominant view, just, again, most people don't even think about it. They're just like, this is the way it has to be. It's what I did. It's what everyone does. And then they think of their kids or themselves as failing or falling behind if their kid is not mapping to what everyone else is doing. Even in the most mundane things, we've been places and people say, well, what kind of books are your girls reading? And we'll tell them, oh, my child's reading, and they'll either say something below, whatever that means, that or more advanced, as if that's some kind of judgment on their child or ours. Right. Where another way of thinking about it is, who cares? People read different things. Again, anyone that walks the face of the earth knows that they have different interests than other people. They have different skills than other people. So it's quite odd to our way of thinking that we try to stamp that out, which is what so much of education is, which is bizarre, because the argument for compulsory education, one of them for the state provided education, is, okay, well, there's multiple. One is, we want to provide everyone with a baseline level of knowledge so that they can be good citizens. Another, which, by the way, just homogenizes them to kind of be almost like sheep in a way. Like, to be a good citizen, you have to do A, B, and C. And if you don't do A, B, and C, then you're not falling in line with the collective. There's the collectivism again. The other was to have experts. So people would envision things like, oh, Little House on the Prairie with everyone in one schoolhouse. Well, we can't have that. So we need to have, this aligned, of course, with the rise of the progressives and the rise of public administration. And that very way of thinking, Woodrow Wilson type way of thinking, was, we need an expert class who is trained on running the state and can oversee public services, public administration, including education. So then, as you put it, you run into these very quickly into these really bizarre tensions where you have all these kind of claims about, we're a free society of individuals and we want to empower the individual. But then you actually sit back and start looking at what's happening, and you are relying on collectivist means to impose collectivism on people in the name of individualism. And this just doesn't work out. It doesn't work out logically. And it also doesn't work out practically once you start thinking about it. And so trying to appreciate that point, I think, is the first step in thinking about the kind of points Rachel was raising.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a lot of parents are afraid to face their own demons with that regard, Rachel, in the sense that, I'll admit it. If I think back, what was I doing, let's say at 10, that I singularly interested in, and that was cooking. I taught myself to cook at the age of 10. I was a latchkey kid, like a lot of Gen Xers. And I would think to myself, maybe my workaholic single dad will come home more often if I cook the dinner. So I'm cooking and I'm standing up on a stool and doing all the things. But I would have spent all day, every day, learning new recipes. And I wasn't just cooking like hamburgers. I mean, we're talking Julia Child level stuff. I watched Julia Child. I was, every chance I got, I was cooking and reading about food, and I was obsessed with it. But that was considered a hobby. It was considered this other thing. And by the time I went through college and grad school, even had taught for a while, found myself left teaching because I quickly found I'm not an organization girl, like at all. I don't fit here. This isn't working. I kept pushing back and getting into arguments. I went into the private sector and then woke up one day staring at spreadsheets thinking, what the heck am I? I'm miserable. I literally packed a box and walked out the door at the age of about 26 and went back to cooking school. I was like, I gotta do something different. I was, midlife crisis. And I remember my dad at the time saying, you probably should have gone to the Culinary Institute from the beginning. And I'm like, now you tell me.
Yeah.
Now you're saying
Mister, what college are you going to?
Yeah, right.
Not, are you going to college? What college? Here's prep school. You're going to prep school. 10th grade on, it was like, you're a pretty good student, but not doing well enough. Go to prep school. Then, on through the chain. And it was a good little doobie. I did what I was told, honor student, blah, blah, blah. But Was my heart in it? No, I had no clue. What am I doing here? Yeah, I know how to be a student, but I don't like any of this. But it's a little late to start your late 20s when you also want a family and you also want other things that are incompatible with being a brand new $10 an hour pastry chef at a restaurant and having to pay rent. So, when I have to confront that, that's why I call it a demon. I think, yeah, I didn't have that person. And I think a lot of people didn't and don't know how to be that person. It wasn't modeled for them to, find out what their kids are interested in. Also, a lot of parents today are competing with this bad boy and the technology that has, dominated their children's lives, even when they've tried to avoid it. And so I think parents feel tired. They feel challenged by competing, distractions, the economy, all kinds of other things. And so it's very tough for them to envision what that would look like. And I think they're scared to confront their own. Like, I know for me, that was the hardest hurdle, to say, you didn't have it. That's why you have to try to give it to your kids, right? But not everyone can go there.
Sure.
It's a little more challenging. So what might you say to a parent who's listening to this, who thinks to themselves, okay, I'm drawing a blank, Rachel. I get what you're saying, but my kid has been in public school for 3-4 years. They've been attached to a Chromebook. They claim to not be interested in anything. And now I might as well just leave them there. The damage is done.
Yeah. And my first response would be, let's start with deschooling. Let's start by just separating yourself from anything that looks like what a school day looked like. And, a lot of families will do this if they leave the public school system or the traditionally private school system, and they start to maybe try to homeschool. They'll take a period of time where there is no agenda. No, there's no parent agenda. There's no let's sit down and do book work out of these curriculums. They will just be with their kids. And that's the first step. The first step is just spending time, getting to know them, asking them, what do you want to know? What do you want to learn? What do you want to do today? What things are you interested in? Let's go there. Let's explore that. And that can lead to so many possibilities, because I know people are afraid to take that space because they go, well, if I don't do things for these 3 months or these 6 months, then we're going to be behind, right? Behind who? Who are you comparing yourself to? Stop doing that. That's the first step, is to get yourself out of that mental block. And I think a lot of that comes from this idea that there are these experts that know everything about education. If I'm not doing what these experts are doing, I am somehow failing my child. And my own life experience anyway, and I have 2 kids, so I'm figuring it out like everyone else as I go. But so far, my experience has been that following the lead of your child and getting to know them and getting involved in things that they're passionate about not only builds a really strong relationship with your child so that they'll talk to you, they'll open up to you, they like being around you, but also they are happy. I mean, they figure out ways to learn really cool stuff that you might have not even thought to teach them because it wasn't on your agenda. It was in your blind spot, but they introduced you to new things they were interested in. And now all of a sudden you're, spending a year learning about ancient Egypt and you're going, okay, well, this is great. You're interested in this. So let's do it. Let's spend a year diving into ancient Egypt, or whatever it may be, whatever their passion is. But they learn all these other skills while they're exploring that area that they're interested in. So there's opportunities to learn a little bit about lots of different things while you're also giving them space to be themselves.
Right. So you're almost like, it's de-school. It's also like de-system.
Yeah. You have to deprogram almost. It's like you have to unplug. Let's just unplug.
I would say the one thing I'll add is, again, some people might hear that and be like, oh my gosh, this is so radical. I can't do that. So let me say this in addition. In economics, we have a concept called marginalism. And marginalism means small steps, basically, rather than 0 to 1, wholesale jumps. And so if what Rachel said, which of course I agree with, since that's kind of been our approach personally, right. Marginal steps. So another thing you can do is have the equivalent of like a vision board. You don't literally have to do that, but like, what, as Rachel said, what would your day be like if you had complete control over it? And then, given your constraints in life, those can be professional constraints depending on your job, personal constraints, whether it is other things in your life or just your mindset that this is radical for you. What small things can you do? And some of them can be quite small, but they're impactful. Let me just give you one example that we do every day that we can. so meaning weather-wise. Years ago with our kids, this goes to your point about the technology. Years ago with our kids, we eat breakfast together, and then we take a walk every morning together. And that walk is a family walk. We don't have technology with us. We're not on the phone. We're not checking email. We're out with the kids. And we don't call it PE. We don't call it we're teaching you anything. It's just out and about. But one of the things we want to instill in our kids is getting out, moving. Again, we're not running a marathon. We're just walking around the neighborhood. We've met a fair number of people, by the way, doing this without trying to, but people see us every day and then come out and start talking to us in the neighborhood. So that's been nice too. And during COVID, of course, this benefited us greatly. But we want to instill in our kids that exercise and being outside and taking a mental break from a regimented routine is really good for you. And for all the talk, again, of things like mental health and ways that we can overcome things like depression, the standard solution is like, well, that kid can't focus. Well, they're forced to sit in a seat for 6 to 8 hours a day. You sit in a seat for 6 to 8 hours a day, and I'll talk economics to you, and then we'll see who's bouncing out of their seat. And here's another way out of this, which science shows that movement, walking, exercising, is correlated and causal with amazing things: mental health, physical health, creativity, just getting out and thinking. And so those are small things you can do. And once you start doing that kind of thing, you realize there's a whole host of different margins, as Rachel was saying, that you can continue to make changes. So if the aggregate, the big picture is intimidating, which I fully get, think about those marginal changes. And I think if you do, you'll realize there's a lot of scope for change in our lives that we can start to incorporate these things into.
Mm-hmm.
I think too that when you make the marginal changes and you start picking off what are the little things that what do we want our day to look like? What are the little things that we want to do every day as a family? Eventually it does lead to this life philosophy. You might not start there. You might not go, oh, I have a philosophy for how I want my life to look like, or that's kind of a big picture thing. But I do think you get there with the stacking of all these little things. Eventually you come to find, this is a pretty cool life we're living because we've just slowly added all these things that matter a lot to us and that bring us joy. And then eventually you realize that you're a lot happier because you have embraced some family philosophy. And I think maybe that's what's missing sometimes too, is this sense of what you want your family life to also look like.
Right. Well, I feel like that's so important to focus on the family relationship. Because one of the things that I see in the system, or that the system does by kind of assuming the role of the parent, and even now feeding the children and providing healthcare, counseling, mental, they're doing so many things that whether you intend it or not as a parent, I think it's easy to just let it all go. Well, they're taking them. What, didn't you notice my kid was sad? Isn't that your job?
Yeah. And this is a very important point because, again, we come back to where we started with individualism versus collectivism. And again, you see a tension, which is when you have the it takes a village mentality, one of the things that does is it insulates people from having to take responsibility because the village is doing it. Well, I don't have to worry about it. But self-responsibility, agency, the idea of embracing and exercising freedom is the way I think about it, analogous to a muscle that needs to be exercised. So it's the equivalent of saying like, well, I haven't run in a long time, but I want to run a race, so I'm just going to start running. Well, you're going to be a minute into it and your lungs are going to be burning. You're going to probably be doubled over, gasping for breath. Why? Because you're out of practice. But if you don't flex and exercise your self-governing muscles, both you and your kids, then you're not going to have self-governing muscles. You're simply going to outsource, as you put it correctly, I think, outsource living life to other people. And then that just perpetuates because you don't do it, your kids don't do it, and then they'll never think in those terms, not because they're incapable of doing so, but because they've never been introduced to that possibility. So it's not part of their vision of the world of possibilities. And so much of life is visualizing what's possible. That's aspiring to things. I am here now, but I can picture a future for myself that is different, that I aspire to something greater, and I
Right.
think I can achieve it. Whether I achieve it or not is an open question. We all fail in life at various things,
Right.
but we have to have that vision and aspiration to do it in the first place.
Now, you mentioned agency, and since we're on the topic of mental health, I have a theory, and I'm not, a counselor or anything, but it goes with incentives too. From the perspective of the child, I think being deprived of agency at the age of 6, let's say, and sometimes for kids who go to daycare, it's earlier, and having to submit completely to this system affects people differently. I think some children take to it, it's not a big deal. But I think in terms of boys in particular, and we've seen more problems as far as boys being diagnosed with things because but I think it's true of both boys and girls. This loss of agency does something to the human being, and you try to adapt to it, and I think there are maladaptations that compensate for the loss of agency. And I can't help but feel like parents forget that one of the imperatives of growing up is to become self-responsible and to be able to take care of myself. There's a sense of safety that comes with that. Now, they don't have it at 6. They look to you for that. They look to adults. So you've now replaced yourself as the adults who are going to project safety and security. I think there's a risk there, while taking away agency, because even kids have that little push me, pull you thing with their parents, but you guide them with love, right? And I think there's a cost. I think there's a cost where I'm seeing a lot of children who are now, in young adulthood and so on, who have themselves, followed that model, outsourced everything. So they've outsourced their thinking, they've outsourced their decision making, they've outsourced their values to the collective. And we saw with the protests, and we see, people were going up and interviewing individual students. Why are you here? I don't know. This is what I just wanted to support the group. So I know people don't think of it as starting at 6, but I think there's a cost to taking a little kid who, when they first come into the world, the vast majority of kids are like, I do it, me. I'm fairly self-centered, and putting them into a system that says, no, that's not how it works here. And you need to do something special or different or whatever to gain control back if that's what you want, or we'll happily take it from you if you're not comfortable with it. So you're never going to exercise that muscle. And I wondered if you had a reaction to my little theory.
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. You see this sometimes too with kids who they've been in the system their whole lives, so they haven't had that agency. Someone's always telling them, I'm going to give you some facts. You're going to regurgitate them on this test. Give me the facts. I'll spit them back at you. Well, what happens when you have to suddenly become an adult? All of a sudden, there's not someone just telling you, well, you need to do X, Y, Z today. Why haven't you done that? Because no one's giving you that blueprint for every minute of your day. So you'll have, students who will get to college and go, they don't even know how to organize their day in terms of the hours. How do I study? How do I fit in time for all these things I'm supposed to be doing? Or they suddenly find that they have so much freedom and they don't know what to do with that. Because when you do get to college, you're going, oh, well, I only have classes this many hours a week. What do I do with the rest of my time? And how do I organize that? And I think figuring out how to step from childhood to adulthood is especially hard when you haven't had any of that sense of self-control about being able to make decisions on your own. Because someone's always determined what you're doing all day, every day, and has given you the blueprint for what they want you to do, and you're just supposed to follow it. And I think that having that agency as a younger child can really help build the skills that you need to successfully move from being a child to being an adult, and to also figuring out what you want your life to look like too. I mean, you really feel powerless with that if someone else has been telling you what to do the whole way around, and now you go, well, now I have to figure out, what do I do after I graduate? How do I do that?
Exactly.
Yeah. And yet, I just to be clear, and I think that hopefully this is clear, this way, what we're talking about, it's not that you don't teach your kids things. It's not that you don't have guardrails. So it's not that you just say, like, do whatever you want. And light the house on fire, and that'll be good. You'll definitely learn a lesson. Yeah, and there's facts too. People need to learn facts, as one author put it. A is A, right? So there's things we need to learn in life. Up is up, and down is down. But there's an enormous scope for self-discovery and learning, and developing skills in areas that are not the standard 8 periods a day. These subjects you have to learn. One of the kind of stereotypes of people who decide to step outside the education system and homeschool, of course, is, well, homeschool kids are odd and they lack social skills and they're weird. Well, there's a couple things to that. Who else is weird? Basically, anyone that's come up throughout history with a major innovation that changed the world, because they have to be weird. They have to view the world differently than other people. And of course, people say, that can't work. That's nuts. And it's like, all right, let's see if it's nuts. Oh, look, it's not. I just innovated because I viewed the world differently. So that's the diversity point about individualism, the creativity that is filtered through the human mind if it's allowed to have the space to do that. But the other fascinating thing is when people have this fear about social skills and social relations, because of course, one of the criticisms of individualism it's only focused on the individual. It's selfish. Well, again, that's a very, to my way of thinking, narrow and incorrect view of individualism. Individualism recognizing that human life is relational, that we interact with people all the time. It's that we're interacting with people who we view as being dignified equals, meaning that they have the same fundamental basic rights, but they're different than us. And so tolerance of those differences within the confines of the general right of their general rights of people is part of living in a free society. But here's one of the great things about stepping outside the school system. It forces kids to interact with people in a host of different settings. And so one of the very basic things that we've done, not other people don't have to do this, we take our older daughter shopping with us, grocery shopping from a young age. And we would teach her about how a store is organized and per unit pricing. Oh, that's math. But it's not math like sit down using whatever the flavor of the week is in terms of the uniform way of solving a math problem. Yeah, I don't even know what's happening anymore. I'll say to
math
Rachel,
appreciation.
Yeah, like I don't understand this.
This is math, isn't it pretty?
Yeah, exactly. Or whatever the 8,000 steps are to solve a basic math problem. I'm like, no, I'm doing it the way I learned, and I think about it. But in any case, those are practical things, which very much in the way you were talking about cooking before, people would say, well, that's not going to get you a job. Well, okay, but it will allow you to function in the world. Having the ability to engage with adults and to speak with them will serve you in the world because life is relational, because understanding your fellow human beings, because empathizing and sympathizing with other people, which require education because you have to be able to pick up on social cues about other people and put yourself in their shoes, is part of human life. And so from that standpoint, I would argue that when you take the framing of an individualist type view, it actually is more empowering from the perspective of contributing to the community, because you recognize it's relational, but the causal direction is from the individual to the community that they are part of, rather than the community is the dominant force that has to conform everyone to a certain set of values that a small group of people select.
Right. I also always question people when they say that about the social skills. Where else in the world, other than perhaps a prison, are you going to need the kind of social skills that you develop in school? And I say that because these kids are quite literally prisoners there. If you go to a school, especially a government school, first of all, you have to go to some school. So even as a homeschooler, you have to declare we're homeschooling. That's why my kid isn't there. You have to alert the government to where your kid is. And then if you send them to their building, they don't get to just leave. You have to get permission slips. You can't be absent. I need a doctor's note. Well, kids are acutely aware of this, even at a young age. They're acutely aware of the boundaries to their own comings and goings, asking permission to go to the bathroom, asking to go get some water, or having to bring a water bottle. The skills you develop to get along when your every movement is prescribed and what you're allowed to do, when you're allowed to speak, when you're not. I remember when my daughter was in public school, you weren't allowed to speak during lunch because the lunchtime was so short and they had to get the kids through that if they spoke, they wouldn't eat. And so there was a whole period they weren't allowed to speak at all. Silence so they could eat their food. And then the last 5 minutes maximum, they'd put on this loud music. How could you speak over it? I don't know, but that was their cue. You can now socialize. And so the kids were like trying to get all their words out. I went and watched a couple times, birthday, you bring the Chick-fil-A for, and I was like, this isn't social skills. In what kind of strange dystopian nightmare are you going to use this skill? I'm going to have an entire conversation with somebody I haven't seen because we're not in the same class in the next 5 minutes. Or you have the kid who struggles because they're shy or they're maybe English as a second language learner or whatever. And you've got your 5 minutes, like, well, there goes that. Yeah.
Yep.
So I find it to be disingenuous when people talk about how are they going to learn social skills, because what you did, just taking your kids for a walk in the neighborhood, is modeling getting out there, putting yourself into the world. You're not on the world, you're in the world. And, oh, look, there's one of our neighbors. Let's be polite and say hello or whatever. I mean, you're modeling this. You don't have to have a lesson about it. You don't have, there's so much modeling that's going on at school that parents, I don't think, appreciate. Some of it's unintentional. It's just the structure. And then there's modeling you do at home or don't do that they learn from. And so I think when you choose to step outside the system, you're also opening up all kinds of opportunities for modeling decision-making, social skills, making new friends, finding a group to go to or a park play date or whatever it is that you need to do. It may even be an opportunity for you to reconnect with your community because you're so into work or who knows what. But there are so many things attached to that system that are more, collectivist and individualist. And I think people get fooled by the lingo, the marketing, the song and dance. And that is another part of the education industrial complex, isn't it? Like, we're going to sell you on this. And that concerns me because they're very good at it. I mean, they have a bottomless pit of money to spend on it, but they're very good at persuading parents they care. How does, the impression of caring work in this collectivist pitch? Why is it so appealing?
Well, there's this idea that you have these benevolent people who are looking out for your best interests, right? So we care about them. We know what's best for them. And if you trust us, we will make sure that they turn out the way that you're hoping they turn out. Your picture of them going to college and being successful. And the best part about this is they'll turn out just like everyone else. And that's part of this thing about, we talked about the socialization part. One of the things that drives me nuts about that is, what other time in your life are you in a room with only people your exact same age?
Never done.
That never happens. It's not the real world, because we'll often hear things like, well, you got to prepare your kids for the real world. They're living in it. The kids who are in school aren't actually living in the real world. They're living in this weird facsimile that schools created that we've been convinced is the real world, but that's not what it's like to live out in the world. You interact with all different types of people of all different ages, and you have to figure out how to do that. And the nice part about just living in the world is that you have to figure it out, because you're not just in a classroom with kids who are exactly like you and are your same age. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing, that happens is you just think, well, they have good intentions. And probably a lot of them do actually have good intentions. Like Chris was saying, we can't assume that they're not benevolent. There are probably a lot of teachers, I'm sure, that really do have the best interests, but within that system, they don't have a lot of flexibility. Even for them, that they're forced to do, you have to get through these lessons in the year. You have to get the good test results, because that reflects badly on you as a teacher and could impact your career. So even if you have the best teacher who would have been, maybe 30 years ago, had the ability to be maybe a little more creative, have a little more time to do fun, interesting things with the kids and allow them this space to learn how to interact with each other in a way that's not so like the 5 minutes after lunch, they might not have the ability to do that anymore, because a lot of that freedom to have this individualization, even within teaching, has really changed. And it's gone once we've gone to this system of teaching for a test. that has really changed a lot of that.
Yeah. And, if we step back for a moment, the question you asked about caring and why is it so hard? I think it poses or reflects, I should say, a bigger challenge about a free society in general. Again, education being one component. And here's the big challenge that all of us who are committed to a free society based on values of individualism face. Freedom does not guarantee you an outcome. It guarantees you space, elbow room to live your life. And that can result in good things. It can result in bad things, but you have that freedom. Yeah. Politicians promise people concrete goodies. Every politician, Republicans, Democrats, regardless of ideology, Green Party, whatever party we think of, they promise concrete goodies. Give me more money, give me more power over your life, and I will give you healthcare, education, security, whatever it is. And that's a hard fight for those of us who are committed to an individualistic view of the world, because the best we can say, which is accurate and logically consistent, is freedom is desirable because it grants you the space to live your life. But here's a byproduct of granting people space to live their life. They're going to come up with really great things because they view the world differently than I do. And so they're going to innovate. They're going to engage in entrepreneurship, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit. They're going to come up with new and better ways of doing things, in addition to being able to pursue those things that interest them. And you can see how that's oftentimes a losing argument, because people, it's much easier for people to say, well, I want the sure thing. Of course, what they're missing is that there's never a sure thing. No. And all those grand promises about the goodies, the trinkets that people in government continually promise, more often than not, are never delivered upon. And then you get stuck in that way of thinking, and you end up in what economists call the sunk cost fallacy, which is we spent a lot of money on stuff, it failed, so now we got to throw good money after bad because we got to keep doing it, because not doing it would be ridiculous. Well, perhaps, or alternatively, the very act of throwing money, good money after bad money, is the absurd part. And you have to step back and say, well, wait, maybe there are systematic features that constrain people from achieving what they say they want to achieve, in which case spending additional money on those programs, on those activities, is a losing cause. And that requires a very critical mindset to think through that causal chain of reasoning. But I think it's an important one to reflect upon and perhaps apply to a whole host of different government programs and activities.
Right. I believe it was Rose Wilder Lane who said that freedom was the tyranny of self-discipline.
Correct.
If I'm getting the quote right.
Yep.
I think it was her. Was it Isabel Pasternak? Anyway, it was one of the two. And
yeah.
And I think there are people who are afraid of that. I think they're in part because they spent their formative years in a system that didn't allow them to develop that muscle. Their self-discipline wasn't what got them out of bed on their own in the morning. It was an alarm clock to get on a school bus, to get to a building, to get whatever. And all those other decisions are made for you. Yes, you have to have self-discipline to do the work, I suppose. But if you notice, they keep rolling that back. And even that's not part of it much anymore. But what I'm seeing is that there are parents who seem to treat this whole conversation as, well, like you said, it was good enough for me. Or when you mentioned, Rachel, that they have to learn to live in the real world, but they're really telling you, it's sort of code for they need to suffer. That, life is suffering, and they're going to be told what to do, and there's going to be things they have to do that they don't like, and they might get bullied, or people might be mean to them, and this is how you learn how to do that, is by this kind of exposure therapy of school. And first of all, there's so many fallacies in there. I don't know, how do I parse them all? But it makes me really sad, because that tells me that parent had a pretty negative experience in school themselves and doesn't can't imagine. The curiosity is what's gone, I guess. When you mentioned earlier, Chris, about opening your mind and being curious and imagination is the thing that seems to be missing, to the degree that now I see people genuinely believing it's not just money, it's this set of experts versus this set, my team's experts,
Yep.
not the other team's experts. Like there are the good people, they're just my people, not their people. And to me, that is when imagination has died. Like it's somewhere in a coffin 6 feet under. If you're down to that level, I don't mean to be glib, but I don't know what to make of that one.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really sad to me thinking about what you're talking about with, oh, they just have to suffer through it because they're going to suffer in life, so might as well start them young, right? Yeah, I mean, I hear this all the time with the bully argument. So you'll hear people say, if they want their kid moved to a different class, or if they want to pull them out of school altogether, because I've seen a lot of that too in the homeschool community. We pulled the kid because they were in a class with someone who was torturing them every day, and they couldn't get relief from the school system. And you'll hear people say, well, it's good for them. How are they going to toughen up for the real world? In what real world would you be at a job where someone abused you every day and you would stay? No one does that. In the real world, you go, I'm going to look for a different job. This job's terrible. But in school, we say, no, you're going to stay and deal with it because being tortured is okay because you're building character. And I don't think that's the kind of character we want to build in our kids. And it's really sad to me that we view that as somehow beneficial for their growth to go through negative, horrible experiences as young children.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it in addition to the immediate short-term torture, which is terrible, and distress that it imposes on children, the child involved in that situation, it also normalizes a certain way of thinking about the world, which I think is quite problematic, because it says this is a feature of the world. Bullying is a constant that's going to be there, so deal with it. And it's true that there are bullies in the world, so I don't want to pretend there's not. But here's an alternative way of thinking about the world. Don't hit people, don't take their stuff. And that behavior is not appropriate. And of course, that doesn't answer all the questions of the world. But if you think about it, it gets you pretty far with many of them. And that's something that a lot of parents try to instill in their kids from a young age in the sandbox. Don't hit people and don't take something that belongs to someone else. Doesn't mean you can't share it. Doesn't mean you can't lend it. But that's inappropriate social behavior. And when you drop kids into a situation and you're like, well, just deal with the bully, or that kind of thing's going to exist. It normalizes that's okay. You got to deal with that, rather than saying that is not appropriate behavior. And the child that is suffering is not the problem. It's the person perpetuating the antisocial behavior, because of course violence is anti-human civilization. No civilization, no society can exist, let alone flourish, if violence is the means of human interaction. It is the peaceful social cooperation which underpins both individual flourishing, but also the flourishing of communities as well.
Agreed. And that's something that I see inherent in the system. The violence inherent in the system. Monty Python lines. So I see the push to break down the individual's boundaries more. It's coming harder now than it was when I was in school. Even when I was in public school, I don't remember anyone ever saying either you should just tolerate it or you need to be friends with everyone, right? So that was the pro-social behaviors that they're trying to encourage now in some schools, where they'll whether it's forced sharing or forced friendships, discouraging cliques are bad, so you can't have a best friend, no hanging out with one group of people because, well, that's bad. So all of these things seem very insidious to me, and designed not just to encourage collectivism, but to actively impede individualism, to crush it.
Yep.
So that the child comes out of 12th grade desperate to find their place in the group, or to find a group to be part of, and finding as many group markers as they possibly can find, so if they get cast out of one, they still have the other. Potentially there's always like a group to fall back on, a team to be on. And the thought of standing alone seems to terrify most of them. And this is very concerning to me because thinking about things like war, it's a lot easier to get a group of people who see themselves as a group or a team or a tribe to be motivated to attack or to do violence or to support violence done on their behalf because they already have this whole othering thing built in. And so you go to a population like that and say, well, now it's the time that we go to war, right? And I feel like it's going to be a lot easier with this type of population of people to do that and to sell it than with individuals. I think selling war to individuals is a lot harder. Am I wrong? You guys are the experts.
I think you're right. There's an us versus them mentality that happens. And when you have that, it becomes a lot easier to dehumanize your enemy. So you don't even view them as human anymore because our group is the human good group, right? We're the ones that have the good ideas and we want to do good things in the world. And since they don't believe what we believe, they're less than human even. They're not even human. It's us versus them. And that's what happens when you have this sort of collective thinking because you do break off into groups and then you end up with these different factions that are against each other. And I think, when you get back to the root of it, when it's really about freedom of association is really what you're getting at there. Do you have the freedom to associate with the people you want to associate with and then not associate with the ones you don't want to associate with? Is when you're talking in school about saying you have to be friends with everyone, you have to like everyone. Well, that's not how humans work, right? We've all met people that we go, oh, that person just doesn't rub me the right way. I don't like them for some reason. I don't know why, but I don't want to hang out with them. That's normal. It's normal to have that. And I think this group think can lead you down to this road where you can see other people as somehow being less than your group. And then they become easy targets for things like war, invasion. You just somehow it becomes easier because you are separate and they are different than us.
Yeah. And of course, the on the topic of war making is collectivism writ large. It is the very nature of making war. Typically, and of course, throughout history, the context is varied, but in the contemporary times, it's nation states that make war. And you even think about the rhetoric today, regardless of where listeners fall down on a specific issue. But just think about the type of language. It's the United States versus China or versus Russia. Or people say the U.S. military should be used against Mexican drug cartels. And so maybe yes, maybe no. But those are all very aggregate ways of thinking. There's no discussion that there's human beings that reside in a geographic space we call China or Russia or wherever. There's people that reside in America. Of course, there's threats because there's always threats. That's just part of human nature. So we should think about those things. But as Rachel put it, it dehumanizes because it's much easier to go to war against a nation when you just say it's them and they're the collective. And
Right.
then, of course, as you put it, everyone has to fall in line. And that's typically what happens during wartime. You're a good citizen, a good patriot, if you support the government, the troops, and so on. And that's certainly one way of framing it. Another way of framing it, which certainly is how many of what we classify as the founding fathers of America thought about it, or at least my understanding of how they thought about it, is that being a good patriot is not simply falling in line and listening to your political masters and doing whatever they say. In stark contrast, it was to have a healthy skepticism of what they said, not because you hate your country or not patriotic, but just the opposite. Because they recognize that in a free society, power runs from people to those that are supposed to represent them in government, not the other way around. And that requires constant diligence, constant scrutiny by the citizenry to ensure that those that have political power are not abusing that power. And what happens is when you invoke collectivist language and methods, it inverts that relationship because it says the individual must be subservient to those that run the collective for the greater good. And if you aren't, you are against the community. You are against the public good. And this is why where we started this conversation on this divide between the individualist or individualism way of framing things and collectivism is so fundamental. And it's quite easy to forget that. And it needs to be exercised. We need to think in those terms in order to, because anytime there's a tragedy in a country or a threat, you can easily see why people say, oh gosh, we must do something. Just the language itself, we must fight this. Mm-hmm. And of course, one final point, the rhetoric of war has taken over life. Now it's not just like we're at war against a foreign enemy. There's the war on poverty, the war on drugs, there's wars everywhere. Where isn't there a war? And so once you
the war on terror,
yes, everything, and so it's a way of thinking about the world which biases things towards centralized collectivist control, which erodes the very freedoms you were touching upon when you introduced this topic.
Yeah. So then thinking about all of this, and you mentioned the founders, and I'm a big fan. So if I think about the purpose of education in the context of America, as I define it, the idea of America, what America, I believe, was supposed to be about, and that is a place where individuals could flourish and have a government restrained to protecting their liberties. And that's like about it. That's the purpose of the government, is protect these liberties. And other than that, that's about it. The purpose of education there would be to empower the individual to continue to hold that, hold the people in those positions accountable to do that job and not more than that job, to make sure they understood what their rights were and weren't, and so on. And that's in its most simple terms, right? Just education to know that in a free society, but also socially and emotionally, or learn who you are, not down to your identities, but just, I end here. Like, I don't have personal power in the lives of other people, and nor should I really. There's some ethics in there too, and that serves a purpose to maintaining a free people, a free society, and a peaceful one too. You see, it's like, I don't like you, but I'm going to just go this way and you go that way, and hey, nobody's hurt. But I feel like education at some point in the progressive era, most likely, veered off into this social engineering project, turn us into specific kinds of citizens for a specific kind of a society, that being a more collectivist, less individualistic society. They were very explicit about that, by the way. I've read the history. And FDR was pretty explicit about the era of individualism is dead. So is it a pipe dream for somebody like me to continue to maintain the belief that the purpose of education is what I described? Is it over? Am I living in some, anachronistic fantasy? Or do you think it's possible to get back there?
It depends on whether we're talking about getting back there within the system or outside the system.
No, I don't think getting. I don't really have any hope. Fantasist.
Yeah, I was going to say you have to be very optimistic to think that the system's going to somehow transform. And
no. The system in and of itself was collectivist. So, like, the system itself is already a thing that does not align with individualism in the world of me. I'm talking about as citizens, as people of the United States of America, not even citizens, just people within these borders who enjoy these rights. Okay, we're born with them. Is it crazy to think that we could start a movement, or we could somehow get back through homeschooling, through alternative means, through a parallel economy of education, that we could somehow persuade people or raise enough people that believe?
I don't think it's crazy. I really don't. And I think that the key to me, or one of the keys anyway, is starting talking about property rights. To me, this is one of the most fundamental things. And it gets back at what Chris was talking about too. If you start with thinking about property rights and teaching people that's the core of living peacefully with other people, is understanding that it's not just property rights in terms of my stuff. So don't take my stuff or break my stuff. It's also over yourself. It gets back to the thing you said about where you end and someone else begins. You have rights over yourself and no one else. You can't touch them. You can't hurt them. You can't decide what they do with their life or what they think. If we can get back to that as really the core of our sort of that initial teaching that you start when your kid's even a toddler and you're on the playground and not forcing them to share. I know that sounds crazy to a lot of people, but
no, forced sharing sounds crazy to me.
But you get a lot of flack for that, But what? They're not sharing. Well, no, we've taught them that this is yours. If you want to have, friends, then, often friends will share with each other. So you might want to consider, do you want to enjoy this toy with someone else? But just because some other kid wants it doesn't mean they can take it from you. That's a different thing. And so that gets back at that initial root of like planting these little seeds of property rights and ownership over your body and not having ownership over other people. And that includes their thoughts, their body, everything. And I think if we start with that, you can build up these ideas of individualism. You can teach people to start, or give them the freedom anyway, to start thinking about what matters to them and stepping away from this idea that there's one idea of the good. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we have this collectivist view that there's one thing that's right and good, and we know what that is right now in 2024. What we've decided right now is the right thing. And I see this all the time, that there's this idea that, well, the way they thought in the past was wrong, but we've got it right now. We know what the right is and what the wrong is. And I think that's a foolish way to think about it, because over the course of time, we know that opinions and ideas always change. So if we have that flexibility and that ability for people to think freely and stretch their brain to think about what a future might look like that might not be exactly the same thing you're scripted to think is right now, that's a big step forward anyway, in the right direction towards having more people accept the idea that you can be free thinkers and you can still have good outcomes. Like Chris said, you're not guaranteed a good outcome, but I think still having the freedom to pursue the outcome that you want to pursue is still better than trying to pursue what they're telling you is a guaranteed good outcome, but also is probably not likely to be something that's going to make you happy.
Right. Exactly.
Here's a reason for optimism. It's very easy to get to focus on all the issues, of which there's many, and challenges in the world. But here's a reason for a couple reasons for optimism. Step back for a moment. Governments, all governments, authoritarian, democratic, anywhere in between, they all rely on enough people in the population subscribing to what they do in order to operate. And we know this if you pay attention. Why do authoritarian governments, some of the first things they do is control the media, control information flows, control messaging, try to turn citizens against each other. So you report sometimes your family members when they're violating the rules or going against the regime, because they know about people power. Why do governments, democratic governments, in those sectors where they can have enormous control over resource flows, education, healthcare, the defense sector, why do they expend so many resources trying to convince people that they are necessary for their good? Because they know that it requires the support of people. That situates an enormous amount of power, if you think about it, in the hands of ordinary people. So that by itself is reason for optimism, to my way of thinking, that exists. Now you got to think about that. You got to appreciate that dynamic, which again is hard for people to do because of the government habit. The government habit, like a drug habit, is I am addicted to government because that's the way it's always been and that's the way it has to be. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's only that way if you allow it to be that way. So then you say, well, I'm only one person. What can I do? Well, here's something, and this is another reason for optimism. Even in the world we live, to the extent we live in a cesspool of regulations and injustices and other issues, many of which are created by past state actions, there's still space for freedom. There's still stuff you can do. Not as much as we would like, perhaps. As you put it before, even those of us who have chosen to homeschool, we still have to report to our state masters that we're not sending, will it please the crown if we don't send our child to you this year? But within that, we have an enormous scope to do lots of things. And we've tried to, and we continue to try, again, as Rachel put it, we're learning as we go along, to maximize freedom on those margins we can. Now, we're not perfect. We make mistakes all the time. We're figuring things out. But there is that scope for freedom. And so the message, I think, of all this is that the starting point is to really step back and think about, like, what is your worldview? What are your fundamental values? What do you want for your child or children? And then what steps can you take within the constraints we face at any point in time to move towards that? And then there's others of us who have made that decision already. And then you need to think about how to go about talking to other people about it. And within that, I think there's, let a thousand flowers bloom. Some of us are educators. Others have, take to social media and have conversations like you have. Others might go into politics. More power to them. It's not my thing, but if that's the road you choose, then I'll certainly tolerate it, even if I don't agree with it. And I just think we allow all different people to do different things. But the most powerful thing is a demonstration effect, is demonstrating through your own actions. And then your children will pick up on that. And they don't even realize it. It's not like you're trying to indoctrinate them into it, but they'll live their life in a certain way because they understand that pathway because you've opened it to them.
Right. I think that's very powerful, and a great way to wrap up our conversation actually is the idea of modeling freedom for your children through homeschooling, or at a minimum choosing an alternative path, because they'll be aware that that's what you've done. And just letting them see you, even like you said, even if it's you make a mistake here, this doesn't work out exactly right, they're going to see that it wasn't fatal, it was okay. Oh, look, I bounced back. Oh, this happened. That's living free. It's not perfect. There's nothing guaranteed. There's nothing guaranteed in this prescribed system either. But I think when kids learn that kind of risk taking by watching their parents do it, and then learning that discernment and those personal boundaries and those social emotional skills, I can't think of a more perfect educational experience, even though it will be unique to your family.
Yep.
I'm so grateful to you guys for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts on these topics. I would like to thank people today for listening, and thank you guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thank you
Deb.
for
We
having us.
appreciate the opportunity. Yep.
With me and my audience today. I will put all of the information about how to find you and your book and all the things that you do, including your social media, down below in the description.